Ladies and gentlemen, what the hell am I talking about? Have you been paying attention? Paul Celan is a poet of silences and caesuras, of times and dates, of ruptures, of a voice speaking outside of itself and to itself, to you and to me, but also a poet of not speaking to a certain no one, of going somewhere, going nowhere, toward a nowhere, that is, toward a utopia, toward an absolute poem, a poem which does not exist. A poet then, not of dialectics, as perhaps my enumeration here makes it seem, but of paradox. A paradox of seeming irreconcilable binaries, but also of more than binaries, a manifold paradox. I have jumped ahead, Celan would say, reached beyond my topic, though not far enough, I know. Allow me a step back. For Derrida, in a certain way, all of Celan's poems remain indecipherable, keep some indecipherability, and this indecipherability can either call interminably for a sort of reinterpretation, a resurrection, new breaths of interpretation, or fade away, perish again. If Celan's poems remain indecipherable, if in their very act of saying they are rendered indecipherable, unreadable, opaque, as Derrida will show us, the way in which they are rendered indecipherable seems each time to speak to a singular paradox, a singular and yet a manifold paradox. Singular and manifold how? For Celan, the paradox begins with an origin story that is the opposite of an origin story. It is the story that begins at the end, at the Holocaust. The end of European Jewry, but more specifically, more personally, that singular event in Celan's life, the death of his parents, that event which must give itself to be read in ash, in the non-being of its being, that remainder without remainder one calls ash. Socrates is the Derrida talk, which is in Radix Matrix, Celan embeds a small parenthetical strophe. Root of Abraham, root of Jesse, no one's root, oh, ours. What he sets aside by way of parentheses is, of course, that which cannot and cannot not be addressed. Beside the point, beyond the point, that is the point. At times less and more explicit, this loss, this absence, this someone who is a no one, and this someone who is a no one is and is not everywhere and nowhere in Celan's poems. But more than that, this reading in ash is a reading and writing that must happen for Celan in German, the language in which the disorigin story took place the first time, in which it takes place again and again, of which it is born. The language is manhandled, killed, put to death, because it is made to say in this or that way, Derrida says. The paradox is deepening, gaining dimension. To invoke Adorno, how to write poetry after Auschwitz. How to write, to say, utter, reach out to the other, reach out to you, in the very language in which one's parents, in which the other, the fellow human being, in which you were murdered, effaced, undone, rendered ash. In his introduction to Paul Celan's selections, Pierre Jury describes a complex double movement of philotes, love, for his mother's tongue, and nekos, strife, against her murderers who are the originators and carriers of that same tongue. A dynamic that structures all of Celan's thinking and writing. This paradox, this double movement, continues Jury, is a grund, ground, but also and simultaneously an abgrund, abyss. In Being in the Other on Paul Celan, Emmanuel Levinas casts the paradox into yet another set of terms. Beginning with Celan's own formulation that he can, quote, see no difference between a handshake and a poem. I recall the beginning, for those of you who were here at the very beginning, Aaron, personally reading everybody. Levinas understands the perfected language of the poem as reduced to the level of an interjection, a sign given to one's neighbor. Sign of what? Of life, goodwill, complicity? Sign either of nothing or of complicity for no reason, to speak without speech, or a sign that is its own signified. The subject signals that gift of sign to the point of making itself into a sign. An elementary communication without revelation. That was a Levinas quote. At first glance, Levinas's formulation might seem like a piece of post-structuralist trickery, the kind of evasive circular reasoning that critics of Heidegger are so fond of faulting him for. But like Heidegger's perplexing prose, it is worth dwelling in and on. A sign which is its own signified, communication without revelation, writes Levinas. The formulation speaks to much more than Salon's neat equation of the handshake and the poem. It speaks to the very core of Salon's poetics, to the paradox out of which each poem is so carefully wrought. If we understand the poem as a sign that has been emptied of its ability to signify, that is not to say that the poem becomes insignificant, or that it signifies its own inability to signify in a way that is flat or one-dimensional. That by now hackneyed criticism leveled, justly or unjustly, I will not venture there, not now, at so much postmodern, quote, postmodern art and literature, namely that its self-reflexive limit condition is too often too limiting, too self-indulgent, cannot be said of Salon's poems. In Salon, as we shall see, as I hope we are already beginning to see, the problem of saying and being unable, is one born of necessity. Out of that necessity, an urgency is born, and of that urgency, the urgency to answer the unanswerable, to traverse, quote, this road of the impossible, end quote, as Salon calls it in the Meridian. Poetics are perfected that move the reader, displace the reader. For Salon, the poem becomes the, quote, place where the person is able to set himself free as an estranged I. The reader is moved not in a one-dimensional way, but precisely in a multi-dimensional way. This is from the poem we start off with. Quote, you, wedged into your deepest, climb out of yourself forever, Salon writes. Speak, Salon commands us in another poem, but do not separate the no from the yes. There is something powerful at work here, something not easily negotiated or understood, something, in fact, never fully recoverable. In Shibboleth, for Paul Celan, Derrida dwells at length on the Solonian paradox in terms of the date. The date, Derrida explains, quote, in the so-called literal or strict sense, consists in making ascending with coded signs. It entails reference to charts and the utilization of so-called objective systems of notation and spatio-temporal plottings, the calendar, the clock, the names of cities. Derrida finds dates as defined in the strict sense, and then at the end of his talk as defined more broadly, everywhere in Salon's poetics. Allow me to recall from the poem with which we began, the strong clocks back the Fisher hour. For Derrida, then, the date becomes the analog to Levinas's sign, which is its own signified, and it is through Derrida's Shibboleth that we can understand more exactly how the multidimensionality of the paradox that Levinas names works. Derrida begins by establishing the special relationship that the poem and the date have for Salon. In the Meridian, Salon makes this relationship explicit. Perhaps we can say that every poem is marked by its own date. Do we not all write from and toward some such date? What else could we claim as our origin? Our disorigin, I might add. No one's root, oh, ours, I might recall. The poem and the date as origin, are inextricably linked for Salon. Derrida writes that the date is a sign that signals or refers to a, quote, memory rooted in the singularity of an event. But this poses a problem. It refers to a singularity that it cannot communicate. The poem, quote, owes itself to its date, to its secret. It speaks only insofar as it acquits itself, so to speak, of such a date, in order to release itself from the date without denying it, above all, without disavowing it. There's a double movement at work here, to use Jury's phrase once more. The poem is tied to the date that it cannot communicate. For Salon, the poet must speak to her origin, must continually point to that which cannot be expressed. What happens to the poem then? It becomes self-reflexive. It turns into a sign that signifies its own status as sign. For Derrida, this self-reflexivity is built into the date itself. How does this work? The date, Derrida writes, by its mere occurrence, will have broken the silence of pure singularity. But to speak of it, one must also efface it, make it readable, audible, intelligible, beyond the pure singularity of which it speaks. The date marks an event, and in the same instant effaces the communicability of that singularity by making it legible. For Salon, the poem's inevitable movement toward the date, toward the disorigin, is, quote, language actualized, set free under the sign of a radical individuation, which, however, remains as aware of the limits drawn by language as of the possibilities it opens. We have come to understand these limits, I hope, perhaps not, the limits of communicability of the singular event of that the date points to. What then are its possibilities?